The wind cut across the tarmac like a blade, sharp and relentless, carrying with it the grit of Afghan dust that never truly washed away. Master Sergeant David Cole stood at the edge of Bagram Airfield, watching the C-130 Hercules taxi toward the hangar, its propellers winding down with a mechanical groan that echoed across the compound. He had been stateside for 6 months, reassigned to logistical oversight after 12 years of forward deployments. The change was supposed to be a relief. It felt more like exile. David shouldered his warm canvas rucksack and headed toward the supply depot, his boots crunching over gravel. The base was alive with controlled chaos trucks hauling equipment, soldiers jogging in formation, the distant thump of rotor blades cutting through the morning air. He moved through it all like a ghost, present but unnoticed. The way he preferred. Inside the depot, fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across stacks of crates and pallets. David dropped his bag on the concrete floor and began sorting through the manifest paperwork. His assignment was simple: oversee the distribution of incoming supplies, ensure accuracy, maintain order. It was a job designed for someone winding down, someone who had already given enough. He didn't notice the dog, and it wasn't until he turned to grab a clipboard that he saw it: a lean, battered German Shepherd mix, ribs visible beneath matted fur, standing just inside the open bay door. The animal was stock still, its amber eyes locked not on David, but on his rucksack. David frowned. Stray dogs were common on bases overseas, scrounging for scraps, tolerated but not welcomed. This one, however, didn't look like a scavenger. Its posture was rigid, alert, the stance of a military working dog that had been trained but abandoned. "Hey," David said softly, crouching low. "You lost, buddy?" The dog didn't move. Its gaze remained fixed on the bag. David reached into his pocket and pulled out a protein bar, tearing the wrapper open. He tossed a piece toward the animal. The dog didn't flinch, didn't sniff the food. It just stared at the rucksack with an intensity that bordered on desperation. A cold prickle ran down David's spine. He stood slowly, glancing at his bag. It was the same one he'd carried for a year's standard issue, scuffed and faded, filled with nothing more than a change of clothes, a razor, and a few personal effects. Or so he thought. The dog took a cautious step forward, then another, its focus unwavering. David backed up instinctively, giving it space. The animal moved past him without a glance, lowered its head, and pressed its nose against the side pocket of the rucksack, the one David hadn't opened in weeks. David's pulse quickened. He knelt beside the bag and unzipped the pocket slowly. Inside, beneath a folded map and a bundle of zip ties, his fingers brushed against something cold and metallic. He pulled it out. It was a military dog tag, tarnished and scratched, the engraved letters barely readable in the dim light. David tilted it toward the overhead bulb. SGT Daniel Brooks 9 Handler Kia Helmand Province 2019. David's breath caught. He didn't recognize the name, but the designation was unmistakable. This tag belonged to a handler who had died in action 5 years ago. And somehow, it had ended up in his bag. The dog sat down, its tail sweeping once across the dusty floor. It looked at David now, not with aggression or fear, but with something that felt disturbingly human: expectation. David stared at the tag, then at the dog, his mind racing. Someone had planted this. Someone wanted him to find it. But why? And who? He looked up toward the entrance of the depot. Across the lot, leaning against a Humvee with arms crossed, was Captain Eric Harmon. Harmon was the base's logistics officer, a man with a reputation for efficiency and a tendency to treat subordinates like obstacles. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes were fixed on David. David's jaw tightened. He didn't know what game Harmon was playing, but he knew one thing for certain: this dog hadn't wandered onto the base by accident. and neither had the tag. The dog let out a low, mournful whine, pressing closer to David's leg. He reached down and rested a hand on its head, feeling the tremor of exhaustion beneath the fur. "All right," David whispered, his voice rough. "I'll figure this out." The dog's tail thumped once more, and for the first time in months, David felt the weight of a mission settle back onto his shoulders. Part 2. The first conflict. David spent the rest of the morning trying to make sense of the dog tag. He checked the base personnel database, cross-referenced deployment records, and scoured casualty reports from Helmand Province. Sergeant Daniel Brooks had been a K-9 handler attached to an explosives ordnance disposal unit. He died during a patrol when his team triggered an improvised explosive device. The official record listed him as killed in action. His remains repatriated, his service dog, a Belgian Malinois named Ranger, retired and rehomed stateside, but the dog sitting outside the depot wasn't a Malinois. It was a shepherd mix, unregistered, with no chip, no collar, and no official record. David leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. Someone had placed that tag in his bag deliberately. But when? And why him? A sharp knock on the doorframe jolted him from his thoughts. Captain Harmon stood in the entrance, his uniform crisp, his expression cold. "Sergeant Cole," Harmon said, his voice clipped. "I need to speak with you." David stood, instinctively straightening. "Sir." Harmon stepped inside, closing the door behind him. He glanced at the dog, which had followed David into the office and now sat quietly in the corner. Harmon's lip curled in distaste. "You planning to run a kennel now, Sergeant?" Harmon asked. "No, sir," David replied evenly. "The dog showed up this morning. I'll have it removed. See that you do." Harmon's gaze shifted to the desk, where the dog tag lay beside a stack of paperwork. His eyes lingered on it for a fraction too long. "I trust you're settling into your new role." "Yes, sir." "Good, because I've noticed some discrepancies in the supply logs." Harmon picked up a folder from the desk and flipped through it. "Several shipments are unaccounted for. Equipment that was signed out but never returned." David frowned. "I wasn't aware of any discrepancies, sir." "I can review the records. You do that," Harmon interrupted. "And Sergeant?" "I expect a full audit by the end of the week." "No excuses." David's jaw tightened. He'd only been on the job for 3 days. The idea that he'd somehow be responsible for missing equipment from months prior was absurd. But Harmon's tone left no room for argument. "Understood, sir." Harmon turned to leave, then paused at the door. "One more thing. That dog. If it's still here by tomorrow, I'll have it removed myself." The door closed with a sharp click. David exhaled slowly, his fists clenching. Harmon's hostility wasn't new. David had heard the stories. Harmon had a reputation for scapegoating subordinates, for covering his own mistakes by pointing fingers downward. But this felt different. This felt personal. The dog whined softly, drawing David's attention. It was watching him with those same expectant eyes, as if waiting for him to do something. David picked up the tag again, turning it over in his hand. He thought about Brooks, about the handler who died protecting his team. He thought about the missing supplies, the deliberate placement of the tag, and Harmon's barely concealed interest in it. Something was wrong. And David had a sinking feeling that the dog was the only witness to what had really happened. Part 3. The pressure mounts. By the third day, the tension had solidified into something heavier. David spent his nights in the supply depot, combing through manifests and shipping logs, looking for the discrepancies Harmon had mentioned. He found them, all right, dozens of entries for equipment that had been signed out under David's predecessor, a sergeant who had transferred stateside 2 months before David's arrival. But the signature on the requisition forms didn't match the handwriting. Someone had forged them. David sat back in his chair, staring at the paperwork. Whoever had stolen the supplies had been careful, but not careful enough. The inconsistencies were there if you knew where to look. And if Harmon was trying to pin this on David, it meant Harmon was involved. The dog, which David had started calling Scout, lay curled at his feet. Despite Harmon's orders, David hadn't turned the animal over. He told himself it was because Scout seemed healthy enough to avoid drawing attention. But the truth was simpler. The dog had chosen him, and David didn't have it in him to walk away. A knock on the door made him look up. Private First Class Emily Grant stood in the doorway, her expression hesitant. "Sergeant Cole?" she said quietly. "Can I talk to you?" David waved her in. Emily was young, fresh out of training, assigned to the motor pool. She'd been friendly enough, but they hadn't spoken much. She glanced at Scout, then at the paperwork spread across the desk. "I heard Captain Harmon's been riding you pretty hard." David leaned back. "Word travels fast." Emily shifted uncomfortably. "I just thought you should know. You're not the first." David's eyes narrowed. "What do you mean?" "The sergeant before you, Sergeant Phillips. Harmon did the same thing to him. Accused him of losing equipment, made his life hell until he requested a transfer. Phillips tried to fight it, but no one backed him up. Harmon's got friends higher up the chain." David felt a cold weight settle in his chest. "Why are you telling me this?" Emily met his gaze, her jaw set. "Because it's not right. And because I saw Harmon loading crates onto an unmarked truck 3 weeks ago, late at night. He didn't see me, but I saw him." David's pulse quickened. "Did you report it?" "To who?" Emily said bitterly. "Harmon's the logistics officer. He controls the paperwork. If I'd said anything, I'd be the one getting transferred." "Or worse." David nodded slowly. He understood. The military ran on trust and order. But when someone at the top abused that trust, the system could turn into a trap. "Thank you, Grant," David said quietly. "I'll handle it." Emily hesitated, then nodded. "Good luck, Sergeant." After she left, David sat in silence, his mind racing. Harmon wasn't just covering his tracks. He was actively selling off military equipment, likely to black market contacts outside the wire. And he'd been doing it for months, framing subordinates to keep the heat off himself. Scout stirred, lifting his head. The dog's eyes were clear, focused, as if he understood the gravity of what David had just learned. David reached down and scratched behind Scout's ears. "You knew, didn't you?" he murmured. "You knew what Brooks found. That's why someone tried to bury it." The dog's tail thumped once against the floor. David stood, a cold resolve settling over him. Harmon had made a mistake. He'd underestimated David, assumed he'd roll over like Phillips had. But David wasn't Phillips. And this time, the truth had a witness. Part 4. The breaking point. The breaking point came on a cold Thursday morning, just before dawn. David had been running supply checks all week, quietly documenting every discrepancy he could find. He'd started keeping a separate log, one Harmon didn't know about, cross-referencing shipment dates, delivery times, and the signatures on requisition forms. The pattern was clear. Harmon had been diverting supplies for at least 6 months, using forged paperwork to cover his tracks. But proof wasn't enough. David needed leverage. He was in the depot, scanning through a stack of shipping manifests, when Scout suddenly stood, his ears pricked forward, a low growl rumbling in his chest. David looked up. Captain Harmon stood in the doorway, his face twisted with barely contained fury. "Sergeant Cole," Harmon said, his voice dangerously quiet. "We need to talk." David set the paperwork down slowly. "Yes, sir." Harmon stepped inside, closing the door behind him. His eyes flicked to Scout, then to the desk. "I thought I made myself clear about that dog." "You did, sir. I've been working on finding it a proper placement." "Liar." Harmon's voice was flat, cold. He crossed the room and snatched the stack of manifests off the desk, flipping through them. His jaw tightened. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" "My job, sir." "You asked for an audit. I asked you to rubber stamp the reports and move on," Harmon hissed. "Not play detective." David met his gaze evenly. "With respect, sir, the discrepancies you mentioned don't match the timeline. Someone's been falsifying records." Harmon's expression darkened. "You're treading on dangerous ground, Sergeant." "I'm doing my duty, sir." For a long moment, Harmon said nothing. Then he smiled, a thin, humorless expression that didn't reach his eyes. "You know what your problem is, Cole? You think the rules protect you. They don't. Not here. Not when you're going up against someone who knows how the system works." He dropped the manifests back onto the desk. "You've got 24 hours to submit a clean audit. No flags, no questions. If you don't, I'll make sure your career ends right here. And that mutt? I'll have it put down by the end of the day." David's blood ran cold. Harmon wasn't bluffing. He had the authority to do exactly what he threatened. Harmon turned to leave, then paused at the door. "Oh, and Cole, if I were you, I'd think very carefully about what happens to people who cross me." Sergeant Brooks tried to be a hero too. Look how that worked out for him. The door slammed shut. David stood frozen, Harmon's words echoing in his mind. Sergeant Brooks tried to be a hero. The implication was clear. Brooks hadn't died in an IED blast. He'd been silenced. Scout whined, pressing against David's leg. David looked down at the dog, then at the dog tag still sitting on his desk. Brooks had known. He'd found evidence of Harmon's crimes, and he'd tried to expose him. And Harmon had made sure he never got the chance. David's hands trembled with a cold, controlled fury. He couldn't go to the chain of command. Harmon had made it clear he had protection higher up. He couldn't go to the military police without concrete proof that couldn't be dismissed or buried. But he wasn't helpless. David sat down and pulled out his personal laptop. He began uploading scans of every document he'd found, every forged signature, every missing shipment log. He sent copies to a secure cloud server, then drafted an encrypted email to a contact he still had at the Inspector General's office, a friend from his first deployment. Someone he trusted. He wrote carefully, laying out the facts, the timeline, the pattern of theft and cover-up. He attached the scans. And at the end, he included a single line. "Sergeant Daniel Brooks died trying to expose this. Don't let his death be for nothing." He hit send. Then he picked up the dog tag, slipped it into his pocket, and looked at Scout. "All right, boy," David said quietly. "We're not running. Not this time." Scout's tail wagged once, slow and deliberate. The fight had begun. Part 5. The fight back begins. The response came faster than David expected. 36 hours after he sent the encrypted email, he received a coded message from his contact at the Inspector General's office. "Package received. Stand by. Do not engage." But standing by wasn't an option. Harmon was watching him now, monitoring his movements, looking for an excuse to strike. David felt the pressure tightening like a noose. He spent the next 2 days moving carefully, maintaining his routine while quietly gathering the last pieces of evidence he needed. Emily Grant had proven invaluable, slipping him photos she'd taken of Harmon's late-night loading operations. Images that showed unmarked trucks and civilian contractors who had no business on a military base. David cross-referenced the truck license plates with local databases and found a trail leading to a black market smuggling ring operating out of Kabul. Harmon wasn't just stealing supplies, he was selling them to insurgent groups, indirectly arming the very people American soldiers were fighting. The weight of that revelation sat like lead in David's chest. He was in the depot late one evening, reviewing the final documents, when Scout suddenly stood, his ears flattening. A moment later, The door burst open. 2 military police officers stepped inside, their expressions hard. Behind them, Captain Harmon stood with his arms crossed, a look of grim satisfaction on his face. "Sergeant Cole," one of the MPs said, "you're being placed under temporary detention pending an investigation into the theft of military property." David's heart sank. Harmon had made his move. On what grounds? David asked, keeping his voice steady. "On the grounds that your personal locker was found to contain stolen equipment," Harmon said smoothly. "Radios, night vision goggles, ammunition. All logged as missing over the past 3 months. David's jaw tightened. It was a setup, and a good one. Harmon must have planted the equipment himself, knowing David wouldn't be able to prove otherwise. The MPs moved forward, one reaching for David's arm. Scout growled, stepping between them. "Control your dog, Sergeant," the MP warned. David raised a hand, signaling Scout to stand down. The dog obeyed, but his body remained tense, ready. "I didn't steal anything," David said quietly. "This is a frame job." "Save it for the inquiry," Harmon said. "You'll have your chance to explain yourself." David's mind raced. If they took him into custody, he'd lose access to the evidence, the emails, everything. Harmon would bury it all before the IG could act. But then, from outside the depot, came the sound of rotor blades, a helicopter landing on the tarmac. The MPs hesitated. Harmon's expression flickered, just for a moment. The door opened again, and a man in a suit stepped inside, flanked by 2 agents wearing jackets marked with the letters IG Inspector General. "Captain Harmon," the man said, his voice calm but carrying absolute authority. "I'm Agent Richard Hayes, Office of the Inspector General. You and Sergeant Cole need to come with us. Now." Harmon's face went pale. He opened his mouth to protest, but Hayes held up a hand. "We have a federal warrant, Captain. You can cooperate, or we can make this significantly more difficult." David felt a surge of relief so powerful it nearly buckled his knees. The IG had moved faster than he dared hope. Harmon's eyes darted to David, fury and panic mixing in equal measure. "This is a mistake," he said tightly. "I don't know what lies Cole's been feeding you. We'll discuss it at the debrief," Hayes interrupted. He looked at the MPs. "Sergeant Cole is not to be detained. He's a material witness, not a suspect." The MP stepped back, uncertain. One of the IG agents moved to Harmon's side, taking him firmly by the arm. David exhaled slowly, his pulse still racing. Scout pressed against his leg, a solid grounding presence. Hayes turned to David. "Sergeant, I'll need you to come with us as well. We have questions, and we'll need your full cooperation." "Yes, sir," David said, quietly as they led Harmon out of the depot. The captain glanced back one last time, his expression venomous. But his power was gone. The mask had been ripped away. David picked up the dog tag from his desk and slipped it into his pocket. He looked down at Scout, who was watching him with those steady, knowing eyes. "Come on, boy," David murmured. "Let's finish this." Part 6. The downfall begins. The debriefing took place in a secure room on the far side of the base, away from the prying eyes of the regular chain of command. Agent Hayes sat across from David, a voice recorder running on the table between them. 2 other agents stood by the door, their expressions unreadable. David laid out everything he'd found: the forged requisition forms, the missing equipment logs, the late-night shipments Emily Grant had witnessed, the photographic evidence, and the trail leading to black market dealers in Kabul. He spoke clearly, methodically, the way he'd been trained to deliver after-action reports. Hayes listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes. When David finished, the agent leaned back, his expression thoughtful. "Sergeant, you've given us a strong case," Hayes said. "But I need to be clear with you. Captain Harmon has friends in high places. He's been decorated, well-connected, and he's going to fight this hard. Are you prepared for what that means?" David met his gaze. "I'm prepared to tell the truth, sir. That's all I can do." Hayes nodded slowly. "Good, because the truth is the only thing that's going to stick." He tapped a file on the table. "We've already started pulling Harmon's financial records. There are irregularities, large cash deposits, offshore accounts, transactions that don't match his pay grade. But we need corroboration. We need witnesses willing to go on record." "Private Grant will testify," David said. "She's the one who first tipped me off." "We'll bring her in," Hayes confirmed. "But we need more. Anyone else who saw something, even if they didn't realize what they were seeing at the time." David thought for a moment. "There's a staff sergeant in the motor pool, Rodriguez. He mentioned to me once that Harmon had him transport crates to the airfield odd hours. He didn't think much of it, but he might remember details." Hayes made a note. "We'll talk to him." The agent paused, then looked at David with a more serious expression. "Sergeant, there's something else. We've been looking into Sergeant Daniel Brooks." David's pulse quickened. "And?" "Brooks filed a complaint with the IG 6 months before he died," Hayes said quietly. "He reported suspected theft and corruption at this base, specifically naming Harmon. But the complaint was never fully investigated. It was buried." David's hands clenched on the table. How? Harmon had leverage. He knew people who could make problems disappear. Brooks was deployed to Helmand Province shortly after filing the complaint. His death was ruled an accident, i.e. D-strike, during a routine patrol. "But you don't think it was an accident," David said. His voice hard. Hayes hesitated. "I think it's suspicious. Brooks was a veteran handler, experienced, cautious. The IED that killed him was placed in an area his team had already cleared. And the after-action report was filed by an officer who's since retired and moved overseas." David felt a cold fury settling in his chest. Harmon had him killed. "We don't have proof of that," Hayes said carefully. "But we're looking. If we can tie Harmon to the people who placed that IED, we can bring charges beyond theft. We can bring charges for conspiracy to commit murder." David exhaled slowly. The weight of it was staggering. Brooks had died trying to do the right thing, and Harmon had gotten away with it for years. What about the dog? David asked. Hayes glanced towards Scout, who was lying quietly in the corner of the room. "The dog that's been following you?" "Yes, sir. He's not registered, not chipped. But he knew Brooks. I think he was there when Brooks was killed." Hayes frowned. "You think the dog witnessed it?" "I think he survived it," David said. "And I think he's been trying to find someone who would listen." Hayes studied Scout for a long moment, then nodded. "We'll bring in a canine specialist to examine him. If there's any evidence, scarring, trauma indicators, anything, it could help build the timeline." David felt a small flicker of hope. Scout wasn't just a stray. He was a witness, the last living link to Brooks. "One more thing, Sergeant," Hayes said. "Harmon's being held in temporary detention, but he's already lawyered up. His attorney is pushing for a quick dismissal, claiming lack of evidence. We have 72 hours before a preliminary hearing. We need everything locked down by then." David straightened. "What do you need me to do?" "Keep your head down," Hayes said. "Let us handle the investigation. If Harmon realizes how much we know, he might try to destroy evidence or intimidate witnesses. Stay out of sight and don't engage with anyone in his circle." David nodded. "Understood, sir." As the meeting ended, Hayes stood and extended his hand. "You did the right thing, Sergeant. Brooks would be proud." David shook his hand, his throat tight. "I hope so, sir." Part 7. The big climax. The preliminary hearing took place in a stark military courtroom on base. The kind of room designed to strip away pretense and leave only facts and duty. David sat in the gallery, flanked by Agent Hayes and 2 IG investigators. Across the aisle, Captain Harmon sat with his defense attorney, a sharp-eyed civilian lawyer who looked like he'd stepped out of a corporate boardroom. Harmon's expression was calm, confident. He glanced once at David, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. He still thought he'd win. The presiding officer, a no-nonsense colonel named Winters, entered the room, and everyone stood. Winters took her seat, adjusted her glasses, and opened the case file. This is a preliminary hearing to determine whether sufficient evidence exists to proceed with formal charges against Captain Eric Harmon, she said, her voice clipped and authoritative. The charges include theft of military property, falsification of official documents, and conspiracy to defraud the United States government. Let's begin. The prosecution, led by a sharp military attorney named Major Lisa Grant, no relation to Emily, laid out the case methodically. She presented the forged requisition forms, the financial records showing unexplained deposits, the shipping logs that didn't match official inventory. She called Emily Grant to the stand, and the young private testified clearly and calmly about what she'd seen. Harmon's lawyer tried to discredit her, suggesting she was mistaken, that late-night supply movements were routine. But Emily held her ground. Then Major Grant called Staff Sergeant Carlos Rodriguez. Rodriguez testified that Harmon had ordered him to transport unmarked crates to the airfield multiple times, always at odd hours, always without proper documentation. He'd been told it was classified. They didn't need to ask questions. Did you ever see what was in the crates? Major Grant asked. No, ma'am, Rodriguez said. But they were heavy. And once, when I was loading one, the corner split. I saw night vision goggles inside. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Harmon's lawyer objected, calling it hearsay, but Colonel Winters allowed it. Finally, Major Grant called David to the stand. David took the oath and sat down, his gaze steady. Major Grant walked him through the timeline, how he discovered the discrepancies, how he documented the evidence, how he'd reached out to the IG when it became clear the local chain of command was compromised. Sergeant Cole, Major Grant said, you took significant personal and professional risk to expose this corruption. Why? David looked at Harmon, then back at the major. Because it was my duty, ma'am. And because Sergeant Daniel Brooks died trying to do the same thing. I couldn't let that be for nothing. Harmon's lawyer stood. Objection. Sergeant Brooks's death is not relevant to this case. It's entirely relevant, Major Grant countered. Sergeant Brooks filed a formal complaint against Captain Harmon 6 months before his death. That complaint was buried, and Brooks was deployed to a combat zone shortly after. The timing is suspicious. Colonel Winters leaned forward. Do you have evidence linking Captain Harmon to Sergeant Brooks's death? We're still investigating, Major Grant admitted. But we have evidence that Captain Harmon diverted military equipment to black market dealers with known ties to insurgent groups. If those groups used that equipment against American forces, Captain Harmon is complicit. The room went silent. Even Harmon's smirk had vanished. Colonel Winters looked at Harmon. Captain, do you have anything to say in your defense? Harmon stood, his jaw tight. This is a witch hunt, ma'am. Sergeant Cole is a disgruntled subordinate who couldn't handle the pressure of his assignment. He's fabricated this entire narrative to cover his own incompetence. Then explain the financial records, Colonel Winters said coldly. Explain the offshore accounts. Explain the photographs of you loading unmarked trucks in the middle of the night. Harmon's lawyer whispered urgently in his ear, but Harmon shook his head. I have nothing more to say, ma'am. Colonel Winters closed the file. I've heard enough. There is sufficient evidence to proceed with a court-martial. Captain Harmon, You are hereby relieved of duty pending trial. You will surrender your weapon and credentials immediately." Harmon's face went white. He looked at David, his expression twisting with pure hatred. But David didn't look away. He held Harmon's gaze, steady and unblinking, until the MP stepped forward and escorted the captain out of the courtroom. It was over. Part 8. Aftermath and closure 3 months later. David stood at the edge of Arlington National Cemetery, the winter sun casting long shadows across the rows of white headstones. In his hand, he held the tarnished dog tag that had started it all. Sergeant Daniel Brooks had been reinterred here. His name finally cleared, his sacrifice recognized. The investigation had uncovered the full extent of Harmon's crimes: years of theft, bribery, and complicity in supplying insurgent groups. Harmon was awaiting trial on federal charges, his career and reputation destroyed, and Brooks's death had been reclassified. The IED that killed him had been placed by insurgents using equipment Harmon had sold them. Brooks had died because he tried to stop a traitor. David knelt and placed the dog tag on the headstone, his throat tight. "You were right, Sergeant," he said quietly. "You were right to fight. I'm sorry it took so long." Beside him, Scout sat quietly, his head resting against David's knee. The dog had been officially retired from service and given to David as a companion animal. The canine specialist had confirmed what David suspected. Scout had been with Brooks when he died, had survived the blast, and had spent years as a stray, carrying the memory of his handler. David ran his hand over Scout's head, feeling the familiar warmth of the dog's trust. "We did it, boy," he murmured. "We finished the mission." Scout's tail thumped once against the frozen ground. As David stood to leave, a figure approached, a woman in her 50s, her eyes red but her expression strong. She extended her hand. "Sergeant Cole?" "I'm Sarah Brooks, Daniel's mother." David shook her hand, his voice catching. "Ma'am, I'm so sorry for your loss." "Thank you," she said softly. "And thank you for not giving up, for making sure people knew the truth." David nodded, unable to speak. Sarah looked down at Scout, her eyes filling with tears. "Is this—" "Yes, ma'am," David said. "This is Scout. He was with your son." Sarah knelt, and Scout moved forward, pressing his head against her hands. She buried her fingers in his fur, sobbing quietly, and Scout stood still, patient and steady, offering the comfort only a dog could give. When she finally stood, she wiped her eyes and smiled through her tears. "Thank you for taking care of him." "He took care of me, ma'am," David said. "He's the reason I didn't give up." Sarah nodded, then turned and walked back toward the parking lot, leaving David and Scout alone among the stones. David looked out over the rows of graves, the silent testament to service and sacrifice. He thought about Brooks, about Miller, about all the soldiers who had fought for something bigger than themselves. And he thought about the choice he'd made to stay, to fight, to finish the mission. "Come on, Scout," David said quietly. "Let's go home." The dog stood, his tail wagging slowly, and together they walked through the cemetery. Two old soldiers carrying the weight of memory, but no longer carrying it alone. Behind them, the winter sun glinted off the dog tag on Brooks's headstone, catching the light one last time before the shadows fell. And in that light, for just a moment, it felt like Brooks was smiling. The end.